If you've ever studied psychology before, perhaps at a high school level or in some kind of Psychology 101 course, chances are you've heard this story before. One day in the 1890s, Russian physiologist and Santa Claus wannabe Ivan Pavlov noticed something strange. He was in the middle of a project studying the digestive systems of dogs, like a total creep, when he noticed that the dogs would begin to salivate whenever they saw the lab technician who usually fed them. Somehow, the dogs had learned that the presence of the lab technician indicated that food was on its way, which caused their digestive systems to kick into action, making them salivate even if there wasn't actually any food. Through a series of experiments investigating this phenomenon, Pavlov discovered that he could train the dogs to salivate to all sorts of cues, not just the lab technician. In particular, by ringing a bell every time he fed them, Pavlov was able to train the dogs to salivate to the sound of the bell alone. This phenomenon went on to become the basis for a psychological concept called classical conditioning. The story of Pavlov's dogs is one of the most iconic in the entire history of psychology, and it's a foundational topic in most intro to psychology courses. But psychology exists outside the classroom, and Pavlov's findings go way further than explaining canine salivation. We can use classical conditioning to understand how we humans experience fear, disgust, arousal, and much, much more. So, today I'd like to revisit this foundational concept in the psychology of learning. I'd like to take a proper look at what exactly Pavlov discovered, what classical conditioning is, how it works, and crucially, how it affects each and every single one of us every single day. Welcome to Psychology I.R.L. Today's episode, classical conditioning and why we buy stuff we don't need. So, back to Pavlov and his dogs. Or not, as it may be. See, it wasn't actually Pavlov who discovered classical conditioning first. That honor goes to an American psychologist named Edwin B. Twittmeyer, whose dissertation on the patellar tendon reflex was published a year before Pavlov announced his findings at the 1903 International Medical Congress. In his studies, Twittmeyer found that by ringing a bell before tapping a human subject below the knee, he could train them to do that little kick-knee reflex thing in response to the sound of the bell itself. Much like Pavlov would soon discover with his dogs, he could train human reflexes to respond to seemingly arbitrary sounds. Now, to me, absolute control over another human's kneecaps sounds like an absolute dream, but the scientific community in the early 20th century wasn't particularly excited by the prospect, and when Twittmeyer presented his findings in 1904 to the American Psychological Association, it was well past lunch, so no one cared to listen to him. Twittmeyer thus faded into obscurity. But not anymore. I'm bringing him back. Down with the establishment. Down with the Pavlovian regime. Twittmeyer forever. Twittmeyer forever. Long live Twittmeyer! But, unfortunately, Pavlov is more famous, so we're going to focus more on his version of the events here. It's important to keep in mind, though, that Twittmeyer's findings were important because they demonstrated that classical conditioning works in humans too. The ramifications of this are obviously far-reaching, but we'll get to that in just a second. So, back to our resident hound mutilator and accidental behaviourist. To test his new discovery, which he called psychic secretion, which funnily enough is something I'm pretty sure I learnt about in Year 9 health class, Pavlov paired the sound of a metronome with the presentation of food. In other words, every time he fed the dogs, he played the sound of the metronome. By repeating this, he was able to train the dogs to salivate to the sound of the metronome even when there wasn't any food. I repeat, a metronome, not a bell. Pavlov, for the most part, did not use a bell. Twittmeyer forever, used a bell. Logically, the dog's response here, its psychic secretion, so to speak, makes no sense because you can't eat a metronome. And neither can dogs, actually. Salivating is a completely inappropriate response in this situation unless you know that food is coming. What's happening here is that through repeated pairings, the dogs are learning to associate the sound of the metronome with the presentation of food. So when they hear the metronome, they instinctively know it's time to eat. In other words, Through classical conditioning, the sound of the metronome comes to predict the arrival of food. This is textbook classical conditioning. Literally, it's in most psychology textbooks. In purely empirical terms, we could define classical conditioning as the process by which a stimulus is paired with an outcome so that it comes to elicit the response of that outcome. But that's kind of confusing. So in more casual settings, classical conditioning is often thought to mean simply learning through associating, often unrelated, stimuli. Just keep in mind that that definition is an oversimplification. Anyway, in most cases, classical conditioning works by repeatedly pairing a stimulus that naturally elicits a particular response, like food making you salivate, with an otherwise neutral stimulus, like a metronome. By pairing these two stimuli, your brain learns to associate them so that one comes to predict the other. Thus, your body learns to respond to what is an otherwise neutral stimulus due to its association with the other stimulus. This is all very abstract and there's a lot of terminology involved, so let's look at a real-world example you may have encountered in your daily life. Have you ever dreaded receiving a notification? I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. Have you ever been dreading a text from an ex, a call from a scammer that won't leave you alone, or a message from your boss when you really don't want to work today? Have you ever been dreading a notification so badly that just hearing your phone ding sets your heart racing? If so, you've experienced classical conditioning. By repeatedly pairing your phone's notification sound effect with negative stimuli, like a text from your boss, your brain has learned that the notification predicts unpleasant outcomes. So it triggers the fear response to the notification to prepare you for the message. In day-to-day life, this is an inconvenience at best and leads to anxiety at worst, but you can see how this type of learning could be useful for survival purposes. If certain sounds, like, say, a roar, predict unpleasant outcomes, like having your face bitten off by a lion, then responding to the roar, rather than waiting for the lion to bite your face off, is a potentially life-saving advantage. The same idea applies to feeling fear to a phone notification. The notification itself is not scary, the harassing message is. But because the notification predicts the message, it comes to elicit fear by itself. But classical conditioning doesn't have to be unpleasant. Let's go back to the phone example. Have you ever been not dreading a text, but awaiting one? Have you ever been texting a close friend about a topic you're really passionate about, like classical conditioning? Or maybe you've been flirting with someone over text. Every time you hear your phone buzz, there's a little rush of dopamine, and when your texting partner doesn't respond immediately, you're left on the edge of your seat, waiting. But then your phone buzzes again, and your heart starts fluttering, and you start getting excited, and you check your phone, and it's your dentist. Well, this is also classical conditioning. In both situations, your brain has learned to associate the sound of your phone buzzing with a particular outcome, and so triggers a biological response, be that fear or excitement, to prepare you for the incoming message. In this instance, for the sake of simplicity, the tone your phone plays when you receive a message is a neutral stimulus, because despite Gen Alpha's best attempts to prove the contrary, humans are not born naturally orienting to iPhone notifications. The sound your phone plays is just a sound. The text message you receive then is called an unconditioned stimulus, or US, meaning that it naturally elicits a response. Whatever your natural reaction to the message is, it's called the unconditioned response, or UR, because you naturally respond this way without conditioning. By pairing the tone and the text, the tone becomes a conditional stimulus, or CS, and is able to elicit the conditional response, or CR, by itself. We can take this terminology back to Pavlov and use it to explain what's happening with his dogs. Pavlov's dogs, by the way, never actually get named. They just get called Pavlov's dogs, which I think is a shame, because according to the 15-second Google search I did, they did actually have names, like Druzhok and Max. So in the case of Druzhok the dog, the sound of the metronome is a neutral stimulus that is paired with the food, an unconditioned stimulus that naturally elicits salivation, an unconditioned response. Through this pairing, the metronome becomes a conditional stimulus and is able to elicit salivation as a conditional response because it has become a predictor of food. Having fun yet? Truth is, that's still not really the full story. I mean, you don't live your whole life waiting desperately for your phone to go off, or dreading it either. I mean, you might if you have an anxiety disorder, but that's another discussion. Point is, once you get that text from your dentist, assuming you're not dating your dentist, I suppose, your excitement to your phone buzzing decreases, right? You unlearn the association. Well, not really. See, many theorists believe that the original learning isn't unlearned, but you can learn new inhibitory associations that compete with it, like my phone buzzing might just mean that I have a dentist appointment, so there's no point getting excited about it. Again, on the assumption you aren't having an affair with your dentist. This is called extinction, and it occurs through repeated exposure to the conditional stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus. So in other words, if you keep sounding the metronome but never actually feed Druzhok the dog, he'll learn not to salivate. The metronome no longer accurately predicts food. And if you keep getting texts from your dentist, you'll stop getting excited when your phone notification goes off, because the notification no longer predicts exciting texts. So that's extinction, but what about learning conditioned responses in the first place? The process by which the stimuli in classical conditioning become associated with each other is called acquisition. Not all associations, however, are acquired at the same rate. Pavlov had to repeatedly pair the metronome with food over and over until Druzhok learned to salivate to the sound. Twittmeyer had to repeatedly pair the bell with his knee strikes before it would trigger the knee-jerk reflex. And chances are it takes more than one harassing message for you to learn a fear response to your phone. It takes multiple pairings for the brain to learn that one stimulus reliably predicts the other. But that's not always the case. Some associations are learned quicker than others. Rats, for instance, are quicker at associating illness with taste than with light or sound, which makes sense because rats eat everything and so have a survival incentive to learn which foods are poisonous and which are not very quickly. Metronome equals food is not a life-threatening association, so it takes some time to learn. But if a food makes you sick, you need to be able to identify that taste immediately so that you can avoid it in the future. You can't afford multiple pairings when your survival is at stake. This is called preparedness to learn, and we see it with certain associations in humans as well. A lot of people have particular foods or flavors they can't bring themselves to eat because it reminds them of a time when they got sick. For example, once upon a time, I ate ginger on a boat ride to combat seasickness, but I got sick anyway. Now, the taste of ginger alone makes me feel sick. It didn't take multiple pairings to learn that association, because as far as my brain is concerned, it's entirely possible that the ginger caused my sickness. And if the ginger was in fact poisonous, I wouldn't want to risk eating it again in case I didn't recover. This type of learning is super useful from a survival perspective, because it stops us from ingesting poison over and over, but it can become an inconvenience in daily life. For instance, a similar effect occurs with people who can't stomach particular types of alcohol, like vodka or tequila, because they associate it with a particularly traumatic night. Again, it's not the taste that made them sick, it's the alcohol, but your brain doesn't know that, so it's safest to just avoid anything that tastes like vodka. One final related phenomenon is when someone has a particularly traumatic drinking experience and becomes unable to stomach alcohol at all. This is called generalization, and it occurs when the conditional response, so in this case, nausea, expands to include stimuli that are similar to the conditional stimulus in some way. So our new alcohol-free friend may swear off of all alcohol because it tastes similar to whatever they drank that night. Or they may swear off of drugs in general because they fit into a similar mental category. Their brain has learned a response not just to what they drank, but to other similar substances. Generalization was famously demonstrated in 1920 by a psychologist named John B. Watson, in a study now known as the Little Alpert study. Watson was a behaviorist, which is a school of psychology that came about after Pavlov and into which he is often dumped, though he wasn't actually a behaviorist himself. Behaviorism came about largely as a response to Freud's psychoanalysis, which, among other things, wasn't the most scientific of theories. Behaviorism then rejected Freud's theories and endeavoured to ground psychology purely in concrete, observable behaviours. It aimed to do away with abstract concepts like the psyche and to focus purely on measurable stimuli in the external world. Because of this, theories of conditioning fit very neatly into this sort of worldview. As a behaviourist, Watson famously claimed that through conditioning, he could turn a healthy infant into, and I quote, any type of specialist that I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and yes, even beggarman and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and the race of his ancestors. Admittedly, in the very next sentence, which people tend to leave out, he acknowledges that he is talking trash, so perhaps he did learn a thing or two from Freud in the end. Anyway, by 1920, classical conditioning was well on its way, and Watson wanted to demonstrate that it was useful not just in animals, but in humans too. Again, remember that Twittmeyer had demonstrated this already, but was forgotten by the evils of academia. Watson decided to test his theory of classical conditioning by traumatizing an infant, which isn't even the worst thing psychologists have done in this field. In the little Alpert study, Watson taught an infant named Alpert, because apparently anonymity hadn't been invented yet, to fear rats by pairing the presentation of a rat with a loud noise, which, naturally, scared the poor child. Through the processes of classical conditioning, little Alpert learned to associate rats with the noise, so that he became afraid of rats by themselves. As before, the rats became a predictor of a scary noise, so he learned to have a fear response to the rats alone. What Watson then showed, allegedly, was that this conditioned fear of rats could be extended to include other fluffy white things, like dogs and rabbits. Thus, generalization had occurred. A classically conditioned response could expand to include other, related stimuli, just like someone who drinks too much one night, then swears off of all alcohol the next. Like a lot of psychology experiments from back in the day, the actual validity of these findings is questionable, but generalization is a legitimate phenomenon and it can have some major ramifications, particularly around issues such as anxiety and fears. So there we go. That's the lesson right there. There was a lot of content to get through, and it goes a lot deeper than that, but this is most of what you'll learn in an Intro to Psychology course. We've learned what classical conditioning is, what the terms US, CS, UR, and CR mean, what extinction and acquisition are, why certain associations are learned quicker than others, and what generalization is. We've also learned about a few cornerstone studies, in particular Pavlov's dogs, Twittmeyer forever, and the little Alpert study. This is all fairly standard stuff, so if you're just here for the facts and don't want to see where the rabbit hole leads, there you go. Go do a worksheet or something. But for the rest of you, I'd like to go a little bit deeper. So far, we've learned what classical conditioning is and why it matters for survival. We've also explored a few relatively low-stakes instances of it in day-to-day life, like how your phone trains you to respond to it, or how you might develop a distaste for alcohol after a traumatic night of drinking. But the truth of the matter is that classical conditioning can be used to understand a lot more about our modern society than what we've looked at so far. We can use the framework classical conditioning provides as a way to understand anxiety disorders, addictions and drug overdoses, for instance. As Twittmeyer and Watson showed, it's possible to train humans through classical conditioning so that we respond to particular cues in particular ways, whether we want to or not. So that begs the question, who is training us? $100 billion garments of clothing are produced every single year. 92 million tons of which end up in landfill. And that's just the start. 1 billion cell phones are produced every year, as well as 85 million cars and 450 million metric tons of plastic. It goes without saying that we in our modern societies produce a lot of stuff. And that means we buy a lot of stuff too, especially in high-income countries. Some of these things we buy because we need them to survive, like food, though preferably not ginger, if we've learned anything today. Some of these things we might not need to survive per se, but we still need them to function in the 21st century, like pencils or USB-C adapters. And some of these things we don't need, but we buy because we think buying them will make us happy. It is this third category of goods I'd like to discuss today. Using the principles we've learned about classical conditioning, I'd like to take a look at the way advertising is used to sell us things we don't need, and in a lot of cases, don't even want. Now, to be perfectly fair, there are countless factors at play influencing consumer behaviour that lead to excessive consumption. For instance, sometimes we buy things we don't want thanks to planned obsolescence, where companies intentionally design products with short lifespans so that we have no choice but to buy another in a few years' time. iPhones are a great example of this, but so are light bulbs and white goods like dishwashers. Similarly, sometimes we buy things as replacements for products we already own because our product is damaged or faulty, and it's cheaper to buy a new one than it is to fix it. iPhones are once again a good example of this. There are a variety of economic lenses we could use to analyse consumerism, but even within the field of psychology, there are still numerous concepts and theories we could apply. For instance, we could look at consumerism from a cognitive perspective, focusing on the ways advertising gains, sustains, and manipulates our attention. Alternatively, we could consider it from the perspective of social psychology, looking at the way conformity, social trends, and observational learning contribute to our purchasing habits. I say all this to make it clear that classical conditioning is by no means the only way of understanding consumerism, nor is it necessarily the best way. It's just one piece of a very large, very intricate puzzle. It's an important piece of the puzzle, though, because it underlies the entire endeavour of advertising. It's also an overlooked piece, because it's so common it's invisible. A lot of classical conditioning feels like common sense, which in many ways it is, and that's precisely why it's so important. I should also flag here that I am talking primarily about the types of consumerism that middle and upper class citizens of rich nations engage in. Although there is a lot of common ground, the analysis is different when talking about people from impoverished backgrounds. Having stuff matters when you don't have stuff. Today's discussion is about buying stuff when you already have stuff, like buying a jacket because it looks nicer than yours, or buying a fancy new phone even though your old one works fine. Today, I want to focus specifically on how advertising uses the principles of classical conditioning to manufacture demand. The thesis statement is this: ads use classical conditioning to imbue products with symbolic value through associations. In doing so, they convince us as consumers that these products will fulfill needs that they really won't, thereby creating demand that cannot truly be fulfilled. As per usual, it sounds absurd when I say it out loud like that, but hopefully by the end of the episode you'll see what I mean. Let's start with a fairly innocuous example of classical conditioning in marketing. Think about how music is used in advertising. TV ads and radio ads are full of music. It's extremely rare for an ad to be completely silent. And if you watch a lot of ads, you'll probably notice that they tend to use fairly similar types of music. But let's think about this from a classical conditioning perspective. What are you really doing when you're playing music during an ad? Well, ultimately, you're pairing two stimuli. And in the case of television ads, you're combining a visual stimulus, i.e. the image of the product, like a shiny new iPhone, with an auditory stimulus, which is the music in the ad. Alternatively, in the case of audio-only ads, like those ads reminding me that I'm an unlovable cheapskate because I don't pay for Spotify Premium, multiple auditory stimuli are being combined. That said, that still usually includes a musical stimulus and a stimulus that represents the product. It's just that in this case, someone is telling you about an iPhone rather than showing you. Point is, one stimulus, the product, be that a new iPhone or Spotify Premium or whatever, is paired with a musical stimulus. Often, the product is new to the audience, meaning it's a neutral stimulus, but music isn't neutral. On the contrary, music makes us feel particular ways. It elicits particular responses. Sound familiar? This is classical conditioning. Music that elicits a particular emotional response, like joy, inspiration, or excitement, is paired with a product in the hopes that the product will eventually come to elicit that emotional response by itself. The idea is that if I repeatedly pair the image of an iPhone with inspirational music, eventually the iPhone itself will make me feel inspired. This potentially helps explain why advertisements tend to use upbeat pop music that appeals to the lowest common denominator. They want as many people as possible to have a positive response to the music. It might also go some way towards explaining why ads like to use songs that their target audience will find nostalgic. Nostalgia, after all, is ultimately a conditional response, which means it can be paired with and used to sell products. Of course, in reality, it's not quite that simple. Looking at an iPhone doesn't instantly fill me with an overwhelming sense of inspiration, of course, but the idea is there. And even if specific emotions aren't fully associated with a product, sometimes all that matters is a general sense of approval or positivity. Hearing upbeat, joyful music puts me in a positive mood, after all. And if my brain learns to associate that positive mood with the product, even if it's just a little bit, then that could potentially go a long way towards making me view the product favourably as well. This is called evaluative conditioning, and it is a type of classical conditioning that occurs when a conditional stimulus is paired not with an unconditioned stimulus that elicits a particular response, like food causing salivation, but with an unconditioned stimulus that has a particular valence or emotional appeal. So by pairing a positively valenced stimulus, something that makes us happy like an upbeat song, with a neutral stimulus, in this case an iPhone, ads attempt to improve our unconscious attitudes towards the product by connecting it to things we already like. This differs from the conditioning we've looked at so far in that we're not being conditioned to perform a particular behaviour. Rather, we're being conditioned to feel a particular way. Buying things is a complex behaviour, way more complex than salivation, so instead of targeting our behaviours, ads target our emotions. And our emotions are important because how we feel towards the objects around us influences how we behave towards them. People are quicker at sorting negatively valenced cards, like ones that say the word stupid, away from their body than towards their body, according to Solarz in 1960, for example. And a similar phenomenon occurs with pushing a lever away or pulling it towards yourself. Positive valence triggers approach behaviours, which bring things closer to our bodies, and negative valence triggers avoidance behaviours, where we push things away. And at the end of the day, what's buying something if not approaching it? With money, of course. Now, I would like to flag here that for the sake of simplicity, we have assumed that the product in the ad is a neutral stimulus, but in the real world, this is not always the case. In fact, with well-known brands like Apple, chances are you're coming into the ad with some associations already built into your brain. So the job of the ad involves either reinforcing or challenging those associations, depending on the image the company is trying to build. On the topic of music and advertising, by the way, a landmark study by Gorn in 1982 found that it plays quite a large role in our decision-making. In this study, college students were shown an ad for a light blue pen and a beige pen, with one ad playing music from the movie Grease, which was apparently the best music they could find back then, while the other played Indian classical music, which they deemed unpleasant. Evidently, Drake had not been invented yet. After the study, the participants were gifted their choice between the blue pen or the beige pen as thanks for their time. Sure enough, they were more likely to pick the pen that had been associated with the positive music, and were less likely to pick the pen associated with the negative music. When asked why they chose the pen that they did, only 5 out of 205 participants said that it had anything to do with the music. What this study would have you believe, then, is that music in advertising is an extremely potent and extremely subtle way of influencing our behaviour. So much so that we're not even aware of when it's influencing our decision-making. The actual validity of these findings is debatable. Some studies seem to support the idea that music influences our purchasing decisions, whilst others question the legitimacy of the original findings, and still others like Vermeulen 2015 suggest that there may be a small effect, but it's a bit more nuanced than the Penn study would have you believe. Still, this is a potentially massive finding that goes a long way towards explaining how advertising works. After all, if pairing a product with a song we like makes us more likely to buy that product, then surely we can do the same thing with other pleasant stimuli. And sure enough, you can probably think of dozens of examples in advertising all around us. For instance, think about the use of smiles in advertising. They're everywhere. Toothpaste ads are the obvious one, but ads for things like beer and pork are full of images of smiling people at barbecues. Chocolate ads have people smiling in bliss, and life insurance ads have people smiling about stuff. Ads are full of smiles. And you could argue that is at least partially for the same reason that ads are full of music. Smiles make us happy. We humans are social creatures, and we like when the people around us are happy. We like being happy. Part of advertising, then, is to exploit that aspect of our nature and displace that happiness onto a product. But it's not just smiles, all sorts of pleasant imagery can be used in advertising. Consider a study conducted in 1989 which involved selling fictional mouthwash by pairing it with unrelated but pleasant images, like pandas and tropical beaches. Pandas have nothing to do with mouthwash, but we like pandas, so through classical conditioning, perhaps we can learn to like mouthwash too. Not to mention, this rabbit hole goes way deeper than just pleasant sounds and images. As one more example of classical conditioning being used to influence consumer attitudes, let's talk about celebrity product endorsements. Now, I'm not talking about when experts are brought in to deliver their opinion on products they obviously know a lot about. It's obvious why a dentist telling me to buy a toothbrush is effective. They know more about teeth than I do, so of course I'll conform to their opinion. I'm talking about Beyoncé and Pepsi, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and iPhones, or Travis Scott McDonald's meals. Why do companies use celebrities to promote their products, even when the celebrity in question has very little to do with the actual product? Well, take a guess. We like celebrities, presumably. Look, maybe you don't like every celebrity in the world, but chances are there are some that you like, whether because they're attractive or because you associate them with other things you like music or sports. So pairing a celebrity with a product is once again an attempt to transfer our liking of that celebrity onto the product. The unconditioned stimulus is the celebrity, the conditional stimulus is the product, the unconditioned response is positive affect, yada yada yada. But what makes celebrity endorsements really interesting, other than the parasociality and the sex appeal, which is still classical conditioning by the way, is that classical conditioning is, in a lot of cases, the reason we like celebrities in the first place. Compare celebrities to the other unconditioned stimuli we've looked at so far. We naturally respond to food, and arguably to music, for instance. These are innate human characteristics, you don't have to learn them. But celebrities don't naturally elicit any response. Despite what a small meme cult on the internet would have you believe, babies are not born with an inbuilt LeBron James response. Rather, celebrity endorsements are an example of what's called higher order conditioning. Higher order conditioning is when you use a previously conditioned stimulus to condition a new stimulus. So in this case, LeBron James was originally a neutral stimulus. However, over time, he was paired with exciting stimuli. Basketball, athletics, memes, and so on. The appearance of LeBron James becomes a predictor of sports. So through classical conditioning, his sheer presence comes to elicit excitement, even when he isn't actually on the court. So, if we then take LeBron, who has been conditioned to elicit excitement, and pair him with, say, Sprite, then, at least in theory, we can project the same sense of excitement onto the product. And notice that I said excitement, not positive feelings, because we can get way more specific than just conditioning good and bad associations. LeBron James, as much as he is a person, is himself a brand. He's a brand that, through careful pairings with basketball, sports, movies, talk shows, commercials, and yes, even brand endorsements, comes to be associated with a variety of specific concepts and feelings. LeBron represents excitement, but also athleticism and victory. So when you pair him with Sprite, you're not simply turning a love of LeBron into a love of Sprite. Instead, you're connecting Sprite to a nebula of associations. The goal here is for people to associate all the concepts they associate with LeBron, like energy and victory and power, with Sprite. In classical conditioning, we often talk about belongingness, or the fit between the CS and the US. Essentially, this means that associations are made quicker and stronger between stimuli that make logical sense together. Music in advertising, for example, may be more effective when it fits the product being sold. Likewise, a celebrity endorsement may be more effective when the chosen celebrity fits the product, like pairing a sports drink with Michael Jordan instead of Pierce Brosnan. And this is where I think we find our answer. Why do celebrities promote products they aren't experts about? Well, because it doesn't matter what they do or don't know about the product. What matters is what they represent. Snoop Dogg isn't better at selling Menulog than anybody else, but what he represents is being laid back, chill, cool. And that's what Menulog wants to be associated with. Hell, Snoop Dogg isn't better at selling the Olympics than anyone else, and he definitely isn't French, but there he was at the opening ceremony because he's someone the Olympic Committee wants the event to be associated with. And this same concept applies to all the other stimuli we've discussed that make up an ad, like music and imagery. They also have specific associations that advertisers make use of. Let's say I want to sell you a car. I'm not going to use just any set of positive stimuli. I'm going to selectively pair my brand with stimuli that have specific associations. I won't use just any pleasant music. I'll use music that's uplifting and slightly rebellious, but in a safe way, like pop rock music. And I won't just use any positive imagery. I'll use forests with glorious speckles of sunlight and endless dirt tracks overlooking jaw-dropping cliffs. And if I get a celebrity involved, it'll be someone who's rugged, capable, and manly. Because I'm not really selling you a car, am I? I'm selling you freedom. I'm selling you safety. I'm selling you masculinity. This is the crux of my argument. Classical conditioning is how companies use ads to turn brands into ideas. Chocolate ads don't sell you confectionery, they sell you decadence. Perfume ads don't sell you a scent, they sell you elegance. Nike ads don't sell you shoes, they sell you victory. It doesn't matter if the ad is logical or makes sense or not. What matters is whether or not it connects with us symbolically, emotionally. A gorilla playing In the Air Tonight by Phil Collins on the drums for 90 seconds tells you nothing about why you should buy Cadbury chocolate, but it's fun and memorable and creative, and those feelings are what Cadbury wants you to associate with their products, and that's why that ad was so successful and won so many awards. Search up the Cadbury gorilla, by the way, if you don't know what I'm talking about. I could take that same car from before, but use moodier, more serious music. I could replace the imagery with dark cities and neon lights, replace the celebrity with someone cold, attractive, and intelligent. Now I'm selling you luxury. I'm selling you convenience. I'm selling you modernity. But all you're really buying is a car. And that answers at least partially the question we had at the very start. Why do we buy things we don't need and often don't want? Because we might not want the product, but we want what the product represents. I don't buy cologne because I want to smell nice. I buy it because I want to be attractive. That's the actual want deep down. The product is just a way of fulfilling that desire. Advertising preys on our innermost desireties and insecurities. A clothing company cannot sell you beauty, just clothes. Toyota can't sell you freedom, and Nike can't sell you victory. All they have to sell are products. But through classical conditioning in the form of advertising, they can convince us, even subconsciously, that what we're buying is something much, much more. Now, some people might hear that and think, well, yes, but isn't the point of advertising to raise awareness about a product? It's not necessarily manipulative. Why are we assuming that ads are intentionally persuasive? Can't they be informational? And whilst that's true, it's really hard to eliminate the classical conditioning in advertising. Sure, maybe your ad is purely factual and is leaving consumers the free will to come to their own rational decisions. But what voice are you using to say all these facts? What font are you writing them in? What type of music are you playing? All of these are stimuli with associated feelings that you're projecting onto the brand. And yes, this isn't classical conditioning in the most literal laboratory operationalized meaning of the term, but it's a very similar idea. We're still changing responses by pairing stimuli. It's just that now the associations between stimuli are far more complex, and instead of changing behaviors directly, we're changing attitudes. And this isn't even just my opinion. I mean, obviously it is my opinion, but my point is it isn't my unsubstantiated opinion. This is, in a lot of cases, how advertising actually works. Think about diamonds, for instance. It's often taken for granted as a cultural norm in our society that you give a diamond ring to your beloved when you propose. That's just how you show your love. But that's not actually a deep-rooted part of our culture. In the 1930s and 40s, the De Beers Diamond Cartel ran an advertising campaign specifically aimed at associating diamonds with the idea of everlasting love. Film stars were photographed wearing diamonds, and news stories about the exuberant diamonds they gave to their partners were ran in the media. The slogan, "A diamond is forever," was incorporated into advertising that consistently paired diamonds with images of a romance. And so, diamonds became associated with eternal love. And through the generations, that idea became a staple of Western romantic culture. And it wasn't just romance. By pairing diamonds with symbols associated with feminism, De Beers was able to sell diamonds to independent women as well. But in reality, diamonds aren't forever. They can shatter. And they aren't even all that rare. That's why it was called the De Beers cartel. They needed a cartel to control the world's diamond supply to inflate prices. Diamonds are just lumps of carbon. Pretty lumps of carbon, absolutely, but just lumps of carbon. Associative learning, like classical conditioning, is largely responsible for why we think of diamonds the way we do. Still, a discussion of the effectiveness of advertising would be incomplete without at least mentioning the social factors at play. Diamonds wouldn't have caught on if it weren't for the social pressures to conform to the trend, as well as the social comparison that made men and women alike feel inadequate because their diamonds weren't as big or as shiny as those of the movie stars. And I think that idea is important, because whilst the foundations of classical conditioning are largely the same, the social context we live in has changed a lot since the 1940s. We live in a world in which, thanks to social media, our very lives themselves are commodities, products we curate to sell to the rest of the world. Social comparison is easier now than ever before. There are literally millions of people you can compare yourself to at a moment's notice. And when we make those comparisons and are left wanting, we look for ways to fill that dissatisfaction. And often, we fill it by buying products, because we've been conditioned to believe that by purchasing products, we can purchase happiness. And it's through this process that companies are able to keep the wheels of the economy turning, to keep us from a point of material contentment. It's not hard, if you're living a mostly comfortable life in a rich country, to reach a point where most of your material needs are more or less satisfied. You can have enough clothes, enough shoes, enough jewelry, enough technology, enough cars, enough money, enough stuff, but who can truly say that they have enough happiness? Basic economics would have you believe that companies produce goods to fulfill needs and desires. But I'm not convinced that's always the case. In a lot of cases, I suspect needs and desires are manufactured so that companies can sell us products. We see happy people in ads and wish it was us. Oh, to be the model in eternal bliss thanks to a Malteser. But products don't really bring happiness, do they? Products work to fulfill material needs, not emotional needs. They're simply the wrong tool for the job. A car will get you from A to B, but it won't give your life a sense of meaning. Gucci shoes might make you feel desirable, but they can't love you back. Despite what we've been conditioned to believe, despite the associations we've been taught to make, I think we all know, deep down, that happiness doesn't come from expensive holidays or jewelry or cars or anything else material. Real happiness, true happiness, only comes from one thing. The downfall of the Pavlovian regime. Twitmeyer forever, Twitmeyer forever, long live Twitmeyer! Thank you dearly for listening. Classical conditioning is really cool. It's genuinely one of my favourite topics in all of psychology. It's super relevant to a lot of areas, including fear, romance, daily routines, education, substance abuse, anxiety, appetite, and nostalgia. It's a massive cliche to say this, but it is genuinely all around us. And I hope I made a case that is relevant in areas you might not instinctively expect it to be. That said, I definitely made a few leaps in my argument today, so as per usual, do your own research, whether you agree with me or not. It's worth acknowledging that this is a really difficult topic to investigate scientifically, because there are so many factors involved. Sure, classical conditioning might contribute to purchasing behaviour, but there are 100 other factors that could too, so even if we investigated these ideas in the lab, that doesn't necessarily make the results applicable to the real world. This is ultimately just one lens you can use. I think it's a useful lens, but there are certainly other approaches you could take, so I'd recommend having a look into that. For now though, thank you for listening. Listening to this show will not make you more desirable, nor will it give your life a sense of meaning. But hopefully, it gave you something to think about.